You are not here by accident, and you are not waiting anymore. Stop waiting to be chosen by a system that never had the authority to name you. Stop watching others be crowned while something ancient stirs uncomfortably inside your chest. That tension you feel is not insecurity, it is recognition trying to surface. You were never meant to carry the word chosen like a borrowed title. That word was only ever a placeholder, a crude symbol pointing towards something far more precise, far more intimate, far more irreversible. Because what lives inside you is not a label, it is a name. Not the name written on documents, not the name spoken by family or assigned by culture, but a spiritual identifier etched into your essence long before you learned language, long before you learned doubt, long before the world taught you to shrink what you feel. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. You keep waiting for confirmation, a sign, a permission slip from the outside. But names like yours are not bestowed. They are remembered. They awaken when pressure becomes unbearable, when pretending starts costing more than truth, when survival systems crack and something deeper demands alignment. That's why this moment feels charged, why your scrolling stopped here, why the word beyond keeps echoing louder than chosen ever did. Because the divine did not mark you with fantasy powers or public spectacle. It embedded a signature frequency inside you, a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of standing that cannot be replicated, outsourced, or revoked. This is not about becoming special. This is about becoming exact. And once your true spiritual name begins to surface, life stops negotiating with your misalignment. What follows is not comfort, it is clarity. And clarity changes everything. Clarity changes everything. And once clarity enters, illusions cannot survive quietly. What collapses first is the fantasy, the cinematic version of the chosen one you were taught to expect, the spectacle, the applause, the external anointing that arrives with fireworks and witnesses. That version was never meant for you, not because you were excluded, but because it was never real. Pop culture turned calling into costume. It taught you that destiny looks dramatic, obvious, externally validated, and publicly confirmed. But the divine does not work through theatrics. It works through precision, and precision is quiet. The reason the chosen narrative always felt slightly off is because it trained you to look outward for proof while your entire design requires inward recognition. You were never meant to be picked. You were meant to be decoded. The label chosen one was a bridge word, a temporary symbol meant to awaken curiosity, not finalize identity. But many stopped at the label, mistaking the signpost for the destination. That's where confusion begins. When identity becomes performative, you start measuring yourself against distorted images. You ask why your life doesn't look dramatic enough, why your gifts don't arrive fully formed, why your path feels heavy instead of glamorous. But heaviness is not failure, it is density. You carry weight because your blueprint is specific, and specificity requires friction to reveal itself. This is the part no one tells you. True spiritual identity is not exciting at first. It is confronting. Because once you stop chasing the fantasy version, you are left face to face with yourself. Not an avatar, not a role, but an internal architecture that has been quietly shaping your reactions, your patterns, your resistance, and your resilience since the beginning. Your divine blueprint is not about what you can do. It is about how you are built to be, how you process truth, how you respond under pressure, how you instinctively protect what is vulnerable, how you sense misalignment before others notice anything wrong. These are not personality traits. They are design features. And here is the inversion that changes everything. If your identity required external validation, it would not be divine. It would be dependent. The reason your path feels lonely at times is because recognition was never meant to come first. Self-witness was. Before anyone else could see you clearly, you had to learn to see yourself without distortion, without mythology, without borrowed language. This is why your awakening never followed a script. It arrived through exhaustion, through disillusionment, through moments where the world failed to reflect back what you knew was inside you. That wasn't punishment, that was protection. Because had you been affirmed too early, you would have mistaken approval for alignment. And alignment is the only thing that holds when systems collapse. The blueprint inside you is not interested in attention. It is interested in accuracy. It pulls you away from noise, away from imitation, away from narratives that inflate ego, but hollow responsibility. And when you resist it, life applies pressure, not to break you, but to force you inward. This is where many turn back. They decide the path is too quiet, too subtle, too uncelebrated. But those who continue discover something unsettling and stabilizing all at once. Your identity does not need to be announced. It needs to be inhabited. And once you stop asking, "Am I chosen?" a different question begins to surface. What was placed in me before I knew how to ask? That question does not seek permission. It seeks remembrance. What was placed in you before you knew how to ask does not respond to applause. It responds to recognition. And this is where the separation sharpens. Because the moment you stop looking outward, you begin to notice how deeply conditioned you were to crave confirmation. Not because you are weak, but because the world trained you to doubt what cannot be measured. You were taught that meaning must be witnessed to be real, that purpose must be praised to be legitimate, that power must be visible to be trusted. But your design violates all of that. Fantasy narratives promised escape. They told you awakening would feel like sudden elevation, instant clarity, effortless authority. But those stories were never about identity. They were about distraction. Because a person chasing fantasy power is easy to manage. A person grounded in self-recognition is not. That is why your awakening did not arrive with gifts wrapped in certainty. It arrived with questions that refused to leave, with discomfort that followed you into success, into relationships, into moments that should have felt complete, but never did. That wasn't ingratitude. That was misalignment speaking. External validation soothes the nervous system temporarily, but it never satisfies the soul. And you know this because every time you received approval, something inside you still asked, "Is this it?" Not out of arrogance, out of accuracy. Your spiritual identity does not expand when others agree with you. It expands when you agree with yourself. That agreement is not positive thinking, it is self-witness. It is the moment you stop editing your inner knowing to make it digestible, the moment you stop shrinking insight so it doesn't threaten fragile systems or expectations, the moment you accept that what moves through you was never meant to be crowdsourced. This is why fantasy power narratives collapse under pressure. They promise elevation without embodiment, authority without responsibility, identity without cost. But your path has always demanded something heavier. Presence. Presence when silence exposes truth. Presence when no one is watching. Presence when recognition is delayed, but integrity is required immediately. That is not glamorous. It is grounding. And grounding is what allows remembrance to stabilize. Because if your identity depended on validation, it would disappear the moment approval was withdrawn. But what lives inside you persists even when misunderstood, ignored, or actively resisted. That persistence is not stubbornness, it is signal fidelity. Your essence keeps transmitting even when the environment cannot receive it clearly. That is why you feel tension in spaces where others feel comfortable. Why you sense distortion before it becomes visible. Why you cannot fully commit to narratives that require you to abandon inner truth for external belonging. This is not rebellion, it is recognition without language. And here is the unsettling realization most avoid. If you wait to be validated before you trust what you carry, you will wait forever. Because your identity was never designed to be confirmed from the outside. It was designed to be remembered from within. Once that clicks, something irreversible happens. You stop performing alignment. You stop explaining yourself prematurely. You stop chasing symbols that were never meant to name you. And slowly, quietly, without ceremony, you begin to feel it. A resonance, a hum beneath thought, a familiarity that does not feel new, only long forgotten. That is not imagination. That is the echo of something real approaching language. That resonance you're starting to feel is not new. It only feels new because time has been lying to you. The modern world teaches you that identity is something you construct, update, brand, and optimize. But what is stirring inside you does not obey timelines, trends, or eras. It predates all of them. Before language became transactional, names were not labels. They were descriptions of essence. They were maps. Ancient traditions understood this intuitively. A true name was not spoken casually because it carried orientation. To know it was to know how something moved, what it responded to what it could not betray without fracturing itself. That understanding did not disappear, it was buried. As societies accelerated, identity became convenient instead of accurate. Names were reduced to identifiers stripped of resonance, assigned without listening. But the deeper naming never stopped happening. It just moved inward. This is why your awakening does not feel like learning something new. It feels like remembering something that was never allowed to surface fully. Time collapses here, because the essence you carry did not begin with your birth certificate. It did not originate in your upbringing. It did not emerge from trauma or circumstance, though those shaped how it expressed itself. It existed before you had a body to house it, and this is the part that destabilizes modern frameworks. Your spiritual name is not a word waiting to be heard, it is a frequency waiting to be acknowledged. A way of standing in the world, a pattern of response, a gravitational pull towards certain truths and away from certain distortions. That is why you have always felt out of step with timelines that rewarded speed over depth. Why you struggled in environments that prized conformity over coherence. Why you sensed that something essential was being rushed, skipped, or silenced. You were not behind, you were out of phase. Because the origin point of your identity does not sit in the present moment alone. It stretches backward through memory and forward through consequence. And when that realization settles, it reframes everything. Your struggles stop looking like detours. They start looking like pressure points designed to keep you from forgetting who you are. Your sensitivity stops feeling like weakness. It reveals itself as an ancient instrument calibrated for truth detection. Your resistance to shallow answers stops feeling inconvenient. It becomes evidence of a deeper alignment you refuse to betray. This is not mysticism for escape. This is precision across time. The reason trends cannot name you is because trends move too fast to listen. The reason labels fail is because they collapse complexity into convenience. The reason you feel restless in borrowed identities is because your essence is older than the containers offered to you. And here is the quiet implication. If your spiritual name existed before the world told you who to be, then no system has the authority to redefine you now. No narrative can overwrite it. No season of confusion can erase it. It can only be forgotten or remembered. And remembering does not happen through effort. It happens through alignment. Which means the next question is no longer, where did this come from, but something far more immediate. How does something this ancient begin to speak inside a modern life? How something ancient speaks inside a modern life is never through volume. It speaks through resonance, not words, not visions, not dramatic announcements that interrupt your day. It speaks by matching something already inside you. Across civilizations, the idea of a true name was never about sound. It was about alignment, a recognition that when essence meets accuracy, the body responds before the mind can interfere. This is why no one could give it to you, and why no one can take it away. Your spiritual name is not something you memorize, it is something you feel yourself relax into when truth is present. A subtle internal settling, a sense of this fits that does not require explanation. Ancient traditions use different language for this, but they all pointed to the same phenomenon. A core identity that remains consistent even as roles change. A signature that persists through memory loss, cultural shifts, and personal reinvention. That signature has been active your entire life. You have felt it in moments when you refused to compromise something invisible but essential. When you walked away from paths that promised security but demanded silence. When you sensed that success without alignment would feel like slow erasure. Those decisions were not random. They were responses. Your true name does not shout. It pulls. It draws you toward experiences that refine rather than inflate. It magnetizes you toward truths that demand embodiment, not belief. It resists environments that require fragmentation to belong. This is why trying to define your spiritual name with language often feels frustrating. Words flatten what is dimensional. They attempt to capture movement in static form. The moment you try to pronounce it prematurely, you reduce it. Instead, it reveals itself through patterns. The patterns of what exhausts you, the patterns of what restores you, the patterns of what you cannot unsee once noticed, the patterns of where you are willing to stand alone rather than betray coherence. These are not preferences, they are signals. And once you see them as such, the confusion softens. You stop searching for a mystical syllable. You stop waiting for a revelation that feels theatrical. You begin listening to the consistent, quiet intelligence that has been steering you away from misalignment your entire life. This is why denial feels painful. When you move against your spiritual name, the body tightens. Time feels heavy. Decisions drain you instead of clarifying you. But when you move with it, even difficulty feels purposeful. Struggle carries direction. Effort generates coherence instead of depletion. That contrast is not coincidence. It is feedback. And feedback is the language of resonance. Your true name is already interacting with the world through you. Every boundary you held without knowing why. Every truth you defended before you had language for it. Every moment you chose depth over approval. Those were not accidents. They were introductions. The realization now is not that you lack a spiritual name. It is that you have been living in proximity to it without fully acknowledging its authority. And once authority is acknowledged, the relationship changes. Because resonance does not ask to be believed, it asks to be honored. Which brings us to the next turn. If this name has been guiding you quietly all along, then the question is no longer, does it exist? The question becomes unavoidable. What happens when you finally let it lead? What happens when you let it lead is not sudden transformation. It is continuity revealing itself. Because what you are beginning to sense now has never belonged to just one version of you. Not this age, not this role, not this season. Your given name belongs to this lifetime. Your spiritual name does not. Your given name was assigned so the world could address you. Your spiritual name exists so you can recognize yourself. That distinction matters more than you realize. Across time, bodies change. Contexts shift. Cultures rise and fall. But essence moves forward intact, carrying memory and pattern, rather than image. This is why certain struggles felt familiar before you understood them. Why certain strengths surfaced without training. Why some lessons repeated until you embodied them instead of just surviving them. You weren't failing to learn. You were remembering through repetition. Your energetic signature has been refining itself across experiences not to perfect you, but to clarify you. Each lifetime, each chapter stripping excess until what remains is unmistakable. That is why superficial identities never satisfied you for long. Why reinvention felt hollow when it ignored continuity. Why starting over never erased the sense that something essential remained untouched. Because it did. Your spiritual name is the through line, the consistent orientation beneath all change. It explains why you recognize truth before evidence appears. Why you sense consequences before choices are made. Why you feel responsible for things you didn't cause, but somehow carry. This is not burdened by accident. It is familiarity with stewardship. And here is where resistance often rises. The mind wants novelty. The ego wants uniqueness through contrast. But the soul seeks coherence across time. Your spiritual name does not make you special by separating you from others. It makes you specific by anchoring you to yourself. That specificity is what follows you. It is why you cannot fully dissolve into collective narratives that deny responsibility. Why you resist identities that excuse harm through abstraction. Why you feel accountable even when no one is watching. That accountability did not originate here. It arrived with you. And once you accept that your essence has history, your confusion begins to reorganize. You stop asking why certain paths feel closed. You understand they were already completed. You stop forcing yourself into roles that never quite fit. You recognize them as echoes, not destinations. This does not mean you live in the past. It means you carry continuity forward consciously. Your spiritual name is not nostalgia. It is orientation memory. It remembers what you are built to protect, what you are meant to refine, what you cannot abandon without losing yourself. And that realization shifts the weight. You are not searching for identity. You are aligning with something that never left, which leads to a quieter, more difficult truth. If this essence has traveled with you, shaping you patiently, then it has also been waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for consent, because continuity does not override free will. It waits for recognition. And when recognition finally arrives, it does not feel dramatic. It feels inevitable, like something you have always known finally allowed to speak. That inevitability you're beginning to feel is the sound of denial losing strength. Because inner knowing does not arrive as information. It arrives as pressure, a pressure that builds when you move against yourself. A pressure that eases when you realign even if the path ahead is uncertain. This is the moment most people recognize something, then immediately look away. Not because they don't understand, but because understanding comes with consequence. Your inner knowing has always been precise. It showed up when something felt wrong long before evidence appeared, when a yes felt heavy, when a no felt clarifying even if it cost you. That knowing did not come from logic, it came from coherence. And coherence is unforgiving. When you ignore it, the body keeps score. Fatigue accumulates without obvious cause. Rest stops restoring. Decisions multiply instead of resolving. That friction is not punishment, it is feedback. Because once your spiritual name begins to surface, neutrality disappears. You cannot unknow what you sense. You cannot return to unawareness without paying an internal price. This is why awakening often feels destabilizing. Not because truth is dangerous, but because it removes the comfort of excuse. You start noticing when you say yes to things that fracture your integrity, when you stay silent to preserve harmony at the cost of alignment, when you delay action not out of wisdom but fear of responsibility. And the inner knowing does not shame you for this. It simply waits. Waiting is its discipline. It does not chase your attention. It does not argue its case. It allows the cost of misalignment to speak for itself. Over time, you realize something unsettling. Your suffering was never random. It was specific. Specific to moments you overrode yourself. Specific to times you chose convenience over coherence. Specific to seasons where you abandoned inner truth for external safety. This realization is heavy, but it is also liberating. Because if your pain has been specific, then your healing can be precise. Acknowledging your spiritual name does not remove difficulty, it refines it. Struggle becomes directional instead of chaotic. Sacrifice becomes meaningful instead of depleting. Responsibility becomes grounding instead of overwhelming. This is the turning point. You realize inner knowing is not a suggestion. It is an agreement you have already signed by being who you are. Once you see that denial becomes more exhausting than truth, you stop asking whether you're ready, you start asking what alignment requires now, and that question changes your posture. You listen differently, you choose slower, you tolerate less distortion, not because you are rigid, but because coherence matters more than comfort now. This is not ascension language, it is embodiment language. Your spiritual name does not elevate you above consequence, it binds you to it. Because knowing carries weight. And the more clearly you know, the less room there is to pretend you don't, which leads to the next unfolding. If inner knowing has already been guiding you pressing against misalignment, then the real work is no longer about awareness. It is about application. How do you let something this internal navigate something as complex as modern life? How something this internal navigates modern life is not through control. It navigates through orientation. Because your spiritual name was never meant to simplify the world. It was meant to keep you coherent inside it. Modern life is not designed for listening. It is designed for acceleration, for reaction, for fragmentation disguised as efficiency. This is why confusion feels ambient now, why clarity feels rare, why so many decisions feel urgent but hollow. Your spiritual name does not compete with that noise. It cuts through it. Not by offering more information, but by removing what does not belong. When you let it guide you, certain options quietly lose appeal. Certain conversations drain faster than they used to. Certain paths once tempting suddenly feel misaligned, even if they promise security or recognition. This is not intuition becoming stronger. It is coherence becoming less negotiable. In this era, alignment is not passive, it is an active filter. Your spiritual name begins sorting inputs before you consciously evaluate them. It flags distortion early. It resists commitments that will require future self-betrayal. It nudges you toward fewer, truer decisions instead of endless optimization. That is why simplicity begins to emerge. Not minimalism for aesthetics, but clarity through subtraction. You stop asking what will advance you fastest. You start asking what will keep you intact. This shift matters more than ambition, because modern systems reward speed, adaptability, and visibility. but they quietly punish coherence. They ask you to fragment yourself across roles, to dilute truth for palatability, to perform identity instead of inhabiting it. Your spiritual name refuses this. It does not rebel loudly. It withdraws consent silently, and that withdrawal changes your trajectory. You begin choosing work that aligns with your nervous system instead of just your skills. You prioritize environments where truth does not require translation. You sense when growth is expansion versus erosion. This guidance does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as steadiness. Even when outcomes are unclear, something inside you feels oriented. Even when paths are difficult, they feel honest. Even when you stand alone, you do not feel lost. That steadiness is rare now, and it is costly, because coherence will ask you to walk away from opportunities that contradict your essence. It will require patience in a culture addicted to immediacy. It will demand discernment when others demand allegiance. This is where many hesitate. They want clarity without cost, guidance without sacrifice, identity without consequence. But your spiritual name does not bargain. It is not interested in winning the game. It is interested in walking you out of distortion intact. And once you let it orient your choices, something unexpected happens. Life becomes quieter, not easier, but less noisy. Decisions stop multiplying. Energy stops leaking. Time begins to feel purposeful again. This is not because the world changed. It is because your internal compass activated, which means the next phase is unavoidable. Orientation leads to action, and action reveals whether you are willing to live as what you have recognized. Living as what you have recognized is not dramatic. It is disciplined. And discipline here does not mean force. It means listening long enough for truth to finish speaking. This is where many misunderstand the journey. They think discovering their spiritual name requires adding something new, a practice, a belief, a persona. But what it actually requires is subtraction, because your essence has always been present. What blocks it are the layers you adopted to survive environments that could not meet you honestly. Reclaiming your spiritual name means creating space quiet enough for it to surface without distortion. Stillness is not passivity, it is a confrontation. When you sit in silence, the nervous system speaks first. Old fears rise, unresolved grief surfaces, conditioned identities try to reassert control. This is not failure, this is exposure. Meditation, journaling, deep inquiry, these are not spiritual accessories. They are instruments of excavation. They slow the mind enough for patterns to reveal themselves. They expose which thoughts are inherited, which are reactive, and which are coherent. They show you where you have been living from habit instead of alignment. This is why the process feels uncomfortable. You are not discovering something foreign, you are removing what never belonged. Letting go of societal expectations hurts because those expectations once kept you safe. They gave structure, they offered belonging, but they also demanded fragmentation. They asked you to trade depth for acceptance, truth for palatability, wholeness for efficiency. Your spiritual name does not coexist with that trade. It asks you to release roles that no longer match your internal orientation, to question success definitions that require self-erasure, to grieve versions of yourself that were never wrong, only misused. This grief matters, because without honoring what kept you alive, you will unconsciously return to it. But once honored, it loosens its grip. Journaling becomes a dialogue with continuity. Meditation becomes a calibration of coherence. Inquiry becomes a filter that separates signal from noise. None of this is mystical escape. It is psychological honesty guided by spiritual memory. And here is the cost most avoid naming. As your spiritual name becomes clearer, certain relationships will feel strained. Certain environments will feel incompatible. Certain ambitions will dissolve quietly, not because they are bad, but because they were built around a version of you that no longer leads. This is the price of precision. You are not becoming less flexible, you are becoming less fragmentable, and that strength is subtle. You stop explaining yourself compulsively. You stop negotiating boundaries internally. You stop waiting for consensus to honor what you know. This does not make life easier, it makes it truer. And truth has weight, which brings us to the final threshold. Because once your spiritual name is no longer abstract, once it is lived instead of theorized, there is no neutral ground left. There is only embodiment. Embodiment is where everything becomes real. Not spoken, not announced, not explained, lived. Because the moment your spiritual name moves from concept into conduct, neutrality ends. There is no audience phase for this, no ceremony, no applause, only consequence. Living your spiritual name does not mean telling the world who you are. It means allowing your choices to reveal it without commentary. Your boundaries sharpen, your standards stabilize, your tolerance for distortion collapses. Not because you are hardened, but because coherence has become non-negotiable. This is the quiet gravity of embodiment. You begin to move differently through familiar spaces, not superior, not withdrawn, but unmistakably anchored. People may not know what changed, but they will feel it. Your presence carries less explanation and more weight. Your words land slower but deeper. Your silence becomes intelligible. Because when you live as your spiritual name, you stop leaking energy into proving, persuading, or positioning. You simply are. And that is disruptive. Embodiment costs comfort. It costs the safety of ambiguity. It costs the ability to hide behind potential instead of action. It costs the option to claim depth without responsibility. Once you know who you are accountable to that knowing. You feel it when you consider shortcuts that would fracture integrity, when you are tempted to say yes to what contradicts your essence, when you sense that delay is no longer wisdom, but avoidance. Your spiritual name does not punish you for missteps, but it removes your ability to ignore them. That is the weight of legacy, because this was never about self-discovery as an end. It was about stewardship. You carry something specific, something calibrated, something that does not belong to ego or image. It belongs to function, to how you protect truth when it is inconvenient, how you move through power without corruption, how you remain human without abandoning coherence. This is what it means to live beyond the chosen label. The label was passive, embodiment is active. The label waited to be affirmed, embodiment acts whether affirmation comes or not. And here is the final inversion. Your spiritual name is not something you use to define your future. It is something your future will be measured against. Every choice will either echo it or erode it. Every season will refine it or resist it. Every relationship will either align with it or expose where you compromise it. This is not pressure, it is clarity. And clarity is mercy, because you no longer wander wondering who you are. You walk knowing what you carry, silently, responsibly, irreversibly. This is where the voice softens, not because the message weakens, but because it has landed. You do not need another revelation now. You need space to stand inside what you already know. What you discovered was never meant to excite you. It was meant to steady you. Because once your spiritual name is recognized, life does not ask you to rush. It asks you to remain. Remain coherent when pressure rises. Remain aligned when convenience tempts you. Remain honest when silence would be easier. This is the quieter work, and it is heavier than awakening. You may notice the world feels the same, yet you feel different inside it. Not elevated, not separate, but less willing to betray yourself for momentum. That is the shift. Your days may still be complex. Your responsibilities may still demand effort, but something has changed at the center. You are no longer searching for who you are. You are responding from it. This does not mean certainty replaces doubt. It means doubt no longer drives the wheel. You will still question, still refine, still pause, but you will not abandon your internal orientation just to feel safe or seen. That is what it means to carry a name that was never spoken aloud. You may feel an urge to explain this to others. Resist that. Embodiment speaks more clearly than language ever could. Let your decisions change first. Let your boundaries adjust quietly. Let your pace recalibrate. Those who are meant to recognize you will not need an introduction. They will feel coherence before they understand it. And those who don't recognize you are not rejecting you. They are responding accurately to something they cannot access. This is not a failure of connection, it is discernment. As you move forward, you may grieve the simplicity of not knowing, of drifting, of imagining potential without responsibility. That grief is real. Honor it, but do not mistake it for regret. What you gained is weight, and weight brings gravity. You will notice fewer distractions hold you. Fewer arguments feel necessary. Fewer roles feel tolerable if they require fragmentation. This is not withdrawal. It is focus. You are not becoming rigid. You are becoming exact, and exactness is kindness when wielded responsibly. Remember this: your spiritual name was never meant to isolate you. It was meant to stabilize you so your presence could become reliable. Reliable in truth, reliable in restraint, reliable in moments when others lose orientation. This is how legacy is built quietly, not through volume, through consistency. There will be days you wish you could forget again. Days when coherence feels lonely. Days when it would be easier to blend in. On those days, do not dramatize the struggle. Return to stillness. Return to listening. Return to the internal hum that does not demand attention, only honesty. You were never meant to announce who you are. You were meant to live in a way that makes distortion uncomfortable and truth unavoidable. That is enough. You do not need to rush this integration. Time responds to coherence. Let your life reorganize at the pace your nervous system can sustain. Let clarity deepen without forcing conclusions. And when you forget, because you will, do not shame yourself. Simply remember again. That is how names like yours stay alive.